Hi there, I'm your host Angelica. Welcome to the second part of our video about how neurodiversity affects relationships from the perspective of the 12 human senses. We talked about the 12 senses in the first part, so if you missed it, there's a link in the description below. Mike, maybe you could start us off with a brief recap?
Sure, Angelica. In our first video, our overall question was this: how does neurodiversity, whether in ourselves or in friends, family, or coworkers, affect our relationships? Neurodiversity means our nerves can develop differently in different people. Our nerves include our brain and our sense organs, which are also neural structures. So neurodiversity is linked in part to our sense organs. And neurodiverse people, such as myself, who has autism, often speak about having sensory differences or atypical reactions to light or touch or pain or other kinds of sensations. Now, in our previous video, we had introduced a theory of 12 human senses. These 12 senses include the 9 currently recognized senses: touch, life, movement, balance, smell, taste, sight, warmth, and hearing, plus 3 more, the senses of speech, mind, and self. Each of the 9 recognized senses has a corresponding physical sense organ. We noted how the physical organ for our sense of balance remained undiscovered for thousands of years. So it's possible that these 3 new senses also have physical organs or neural structures that haven't been discovered yet. If so, then these 3 new senses might also be linked by their physical organs to neurodevelopment and neurodiversity. At the same time, they're linked to relationships. Our sense of speech helps us understand what another person is communicating, both verbally and non-verbally. Our sense of mind gives us the ability to be in sync with the thoughts and mental images other people around us are having. And our sense of self allows us to sense how other people are very different than we are, drawing us out of our own bubble and being more accepting of others. So these 3 new senses are also closely tied to our relationships, to our social communication and interaction skills.
Thank you for the great summary. So these 3 senses might connect relationships with neurodiversity, but how exactly?
Well, let's look at how we learn about relationships when we're children. Specifically, one of the most important ways we learn to communicate with others is through language. An infant or toddler learns to speak and understand the language in their social environment. But how do they do this? No one could communicate to a pre-linguistic infant that they were supposed to learn to speak and understand the meanings of the words they hear, unless the infant somehow already knew what meanings were. A pre-linguistic infant who does not already know a language cannot have the idea of language explained to them by someone else using language. This might work for a second language, but not for a first language. A first language cannot be acquired through instruction, only through direct sense experience. And this is done through their sense of speech, the ability to sense meaning behind some kind of verbal or nonverbal expression, which we covered in our first video. Infants and toddlers come to know all kinds of expressions and meanings through their sense of speech, just like how they come to know all kinds of colors or tastes through their other senses. Just imagine how busy an infant or toddler must be at this age, figuring out how to use their eyes to see and ears to hear, how to taste and smell, how to use their body to move around, learning how to balance themselves, and so much more that relates to their physical environment. And in the same way, they're also learning how to sense outwards into their social environment. They also have to learn how to use their senses of speech, mind, and self to sense the meaning of verbal and nonverbal expressions, the mental activities in others, and the unique individualness of others. These 3 senses in particular allow the infant or toddler to learn their basic social communication and interaction skills, which lay foundations for their future relationships. And so, linking back to neurodiversity, if someone's senses develop differently at this age, this might have an impact on their abilities to communicate and interact in relationships.
Right. Yeah. That actually makes a lot of sense.
Let's link this to something else, how some people have color blindness. A person with color blindness can see all right, except they can't see certain colors, or maybe they can't see any colors at all, depending on the severity. Color blindness might be considered an aspect of neurodiversity, because for some people, the nerves associated with their eyes develop differently, making them unable to see colors the same way as other people. Now, let's imagine there could be something analogous to color blindness in our sense of speech. To be clear, I am now postulating two things. First, that there is some kind of neural structure that gives us a sense of speech, and also that this neural structure might be susceptible to developmental differences that produce a partial impairment. In other words, it's possible that neurodiversity could cause differences in our sense of speech, something analogous to colorblindness. It's possible that someone might be physiologically less capable of sensing the meaning behind certain kinds of highly complex expressions, such as social cues or body language or facial expressions, while still being able to sense other kinds of expressions just fine. And I believe, based on my own personal experience, that this might be what happens in some cases of neurodiversity, such as autism.
Right. Colorblindness is actually a really good analogy. So just like how someone may see most colors and just mix up red and green, someone with neurodiversity in their sense of speech may understand most of what people say or mean, but may have difficulty in a specific area and miss some subtleties.
Can I give you a personal example of this colorblindness in my own sense of speech?
Yeah, go for it.
When I was young, about your age, I went on a month-long trip to Asia. Someone told me before I left that it was a good idea, if I wanted to meet people, to take along some of those Canada pins, those little Canadian flags with a pin and a clasp behind. So I did that. I went to a government office and I got a whole bag of those pins and carried a few in my pocket at all times while I was in Asia. One day, I met a young Asian woman, and so I went up to her and put a pin on her collar. She was holding something, and so I kind of had to maneuver a bit to put the pin on her collar without poking her, but I managed all right. Then I stepped back, expecting her to react positively somehow, like most other people did when I gave them a pin. But instead, she responded very strangely, not happy, not sure what, but definitely upset or confused or dumbstruck, something I wasn't expecting. I couldn't decipher her reaction. For a long time afterwards, this experience stuck with me. What had I done that made her react so strangely? In going over this experience in my memory, it finally occurred to me to try to recall what it was that she was holding in her arms, that I had to maneuver around. And then I remembered that it was a baby. She had been holding a little baby, maybe 3 or 4 months old. Maybe it was her own baby. In any case, it just hadn't occurred to me at the time, and not even for a long time afterwards, that the baby was important to this situation. I had missed the social cue and basically had treated her baby like some unimportant, inanimate object. But later, when I had the chance to think and reason through what had happened, I realized it would probably have been better had I put the pin on the baby or had done something else, basically not done what I actually did. And now I could understand the lady's reaction better too. She must have thought my reaction to her and her baby was very strange. How I ignored her baby instead of acknowledging her baby, which is the expected social behavior. But the fact is, at the time, I simply didn't sense how the baby was important. I didn't catch the meaning of the baby, the role the baby played in the whole social situation. This story explains something about how I, as an autistic person, experience the world. And my life is full of stories like this, where I just didn't have a clue what I missed in some situation or other. This was one of the few times that I was able to figure out on my own what it was that I had missed. But most of the time, I have no idea what I miss, obviously, because it's what I don't perceive. In most cases, I can't figure out and will never know why this or that situation was so odd. And not knowing also makes it hard for me to learn from social experience. From my perspective, people can sometimes behave unpredictably and then often negatively. And from their perspective, I'm probably the one who's acting strangely and negatively. It's not that I intentionally try to act in odd ways. It really is that I just don't perceive things the same way other people do. So that's how I came to the idea that I personally might be partially blind in my sense of speech. Many times, the meanings of things seem completely obvious to everyone else, to people who have a typical sense of speech, but not to me. And so my behavior comes off as strange or even ridiculous, and my relationships suffer.
Wow. Yeah, I can only imagine how frustrating that is. It kind of sounds like you're walking around with your eyes covered. I don't know what it's like to be autistic, but your explanation makes me feel like I could have a better understanding for what it might feel like.
Yes, it's one thing to say that some autistic people don't understand social cues and facial expressions, but for many people that's just an abstract statement they can't relate to. I believe these are direct sensations, like color. Nobody tells you what dark blue looks like, you just see it. You also don't think through what a facial expression means. You just sense the meaning, more or less unconsciously, with your sense of speech. Some people, such as myself, might be partially blind to certain expressions of meaning. It's not that I don't want to or that I lack intelligence or anything like that. I see the expression. I just don't get the meaning. Like with the baby, I saw the baby. I just didn't sense the social cue, the meaning within the social context. So I have to compensate by thinking, by trying to analyze every aspect of a social situation. That's why I like to prepare for social situations in advance, so I can think through as much as possible beforehand. But if a situation is spontaneous or if things change, it can be really hard for me to keep up because my thinking can't always encompass every detail in real time. And so I make social blunders sometimes. This seems, at least to me, to be very different from the way neurotypical people experience social situations. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they seem to just dive into a social situation and sense what is going on, more or less unconsciously. They interact with each other instinctively, and when things change, they seem to just flow along with whatever's happening by sensing and reacting. But this approach doesn't work for me. The sensing part is not fully there, so my reactions are sometimes off. In my own experience, it really seems like a kind of partial blindness in my sense of speech, something I believe is linked to autism and neurodiversity, which has a significant impact on my relationships.
Right. Okay. So for my sense of speech, I would say that I am neurotypical. And yes, I can confirm that whenever I walk into a room, I rely heavily on social cues, facial expressions, tones in people's voices, body language, etc., to tell me how I should behave or respond in any given situation. And I've actually almost never felt lost or confused the way you've described. So I'm beginning to see how challenging relationships can be when you're going in, as you say, colorblind.
Yeah, being autistic can be very challenging sometimes. I've been talking a bit about my own personal experiences and insights. However, other neurodiverse people might have completely different personal experiences. For example, it's possible that someone is overly sensitive to expressions of meaning, or someone with neurodiversity might be differently sensitive in other senses, in the sense of mind or sense of self. And these sensory differences might have a big impact on their relationships. Remember when we spoke about color blindness as a sensory difference? What if a person with color blindness chooses a gift for a friend that by mistake was the wrong color? Would they not come off as awkward in that situation? Or someone who's hard of hearing, who mishears what someone says? In saying all of this, I'm hoping that others might find it helpful. I'm hoping it points out a way for people to understand themselves and others better.
Yeah, I definitely think putting your experience into words in combination with the 12 senses will help give others the language and the foundational knowledge to help them better explore and understand their own personal experiences regarding neurodiversity and relationships.
Yeah, I believe that a comprehensive theory of sensation that includes all 12 of our human senses might provide a useful framework for understanding how neurodiversity affects our relationships. Neurodiversity means our nerves grow in a different way, and then we, that is our soul or psyche, find ourselves living in a body that is structured in a certain way. It's something like putting your hand into a glove that doesn't quite fit. Maybe the glove is too small and the hand feels too big for it, leaving flappy parts. Or maybe the glove is too big and the hand feels too small inside this big roomy glove. Or maybe the glove just isn't right in some other way. Neurodiversity feels like we have a body that our soul, our psyche, doesn't fit into quite right. It seems to be an incarnation issue, a karmic issue. But that might be something we explore some other time.
Wow, that is all very interesting. That explains a lot about how a theory of the 12 senses might help us think differently about the link between neurodiversity and relationships. Thank you so much, and I look forward to our next video. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and consider sharing with a friend. Check out our other videos and playlists. There's a link to our website in the description below. Thank you for watching.